Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1852, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, herself a Connecticut-born teacher at Hartford Female Seminary, and of course an abolitionist. It became the best-selling novel of the 19th century, the second most printed book behind the Bible. In the book, the primary character, the protagonist, is a man named Uncle Tom, a fictional black slave, but a man based upon the memoirs of a slave who had escaped to Canada. Stowe read the memoirs, was inspired by them, and created the character in his image. The theme of the book is fairly straightforward. It is about the immorality of the institution of slavery, especially family separation and the harsh treatment of individual slaves. In that, she points out injustice, shines a light upon it, and then the secondary theme of the book is the moral power of women to help those around them that are suffering injustice. So she points a path forward of working for justice. Abraham Lincoln, after the war started, met Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it was reported, probably apocryphal, he didn't probably say it, but it sounds real true, and it's a great quote. He's supposed to have said, "So this is the little lady who started this great war." Because there's truth to that. There was a significant impact on the abolitionist movement in the United States from this book. People in the South were outraged. There were actually a number of books written that tried to show how wonderful it was like for the slaves, as opposed to what Stowe had written. Her book helped propel the election of Abraham Lincoln, and of course then secession, war, and emancipation. It was a massive impact for a novel. Consider that thought, the impact of her words, as we look at Mark chapter 6. We pick back up in the Gospel of Mark where we left off at the start of Advent, and we hear this. King Herod heard about this, for Jesus' name had become well known. Let me remind you what the previous chapter or two was talking about, what the this is. This follows after the sending of the 12 in pairs, after they had spread out and gone to village, sharing the good news of the kingdom of God. In addition, this takes place after Jesus had raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. So it's that kind of thing that Herod is aware of. And it would have been unusual for someone like Herod to not have heard quite a bit, probably, about so popular a figure. Jesus is a public speaker, he's a faith healer, he's a prophet. People are talking about him everywhere, and much of it is within the territory that Herod is in charge of, so of course he heard about him. This is Herod Antipas. That's hard to keep the Herods straight because there's a whole bunch of them. The one that we're talking about here is the son of Herod the Great. That's the Herod alive in the Nativity story. So this is his son, a generation later. He is the tetrarch, or the ruler, of both Galilee, where Jesus is from, and Perea. Perea is on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea. In local politics, Herod Antipas is a big fish. He's got a lot of juice, a lot of weight here in Galilee and Judea and in this area. But in the Roman Empire, he's a small fish. There are dozens of men like him, client kings, you might call them less generously, puppet kings, that the Romans used to help rule areas. He's one of those. He's heard about Jesus. Now we're back to the people. Some of the people, were saying, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work at him. If you've been reading the text from the beginning, you're probably saying, when did John die? That hasn't happened. When did that happen? We're getting to that. We'll explain his death in a moment. The common people saw a connection between the downfall of John, his arrest and death, and Jesus' rise to prominence. The one followed after the other. They supposed that a resurrected John the Baptist would have miraculous powers. If God raised him from the dead, he's going to give him some power to do stuff, because John wasn't known for miracles. We don't read anywhere about John healing the lame or raising the dead or making the blind see or any of that. That wasn't his mission. So some people thought John the Baptist is back. Others said he is Elijah. If you remember, the prophet Malachi spoke of a return of Elijah. He said this, "Before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes, Elijah will return." So for those with an apocalyptic viewpoint, for the people living that saw great events unfolding and thought this is the day, they saw Jesus as a sign of the end times, a harbinger of big things. There's always people with that outlook, right? They look at the news and they say, something big is happening. Others claimed he's a prophet, like one of the prophets of long ago. Other people were not so excitable. They were more prosaic, and they simply said Jesus is just a continuation. We had prophets back in the day, Elijah and Isaiah and the rest, and he's another one of those. Nothing, but nothing unique, just another prophet. But what about Herod? We're talking about Herod for a reason. When Herod heard this, he said, "John, whom I beheaded, has been raised from the dead." Now we learn how John died. We'll get back to that. Public opinion, as Mark tells us, was all over the place about Jesus. He's John back from the dead. He's Elijah. He's a prophet. They didn't know. They weren't sure. There was a lot of opinion. But Herod jumps at the idea. Herod seizes on the thought that it's John the Baptist raised from the dead. The question, of course, is why? What made that idea pop in Herod's mind? I think the answer is pretty easy. A guilty conscience. Herod had a guilty conscience about what he had done, and so he sees this. He's projecting this. Shakespeare knew about this. Shakespeare uses this idea a number of times. In Hamlet, Hamlet's uncle Claudius murders his father and marries his mother, not unlike the plot of what we're talking about this morning. And Hamlet sets up a play to mirror that behavior in order to get his uncle to break down in guilt. He says famously, "The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king." He's trying to use that, and of course it works. And then famously in Macbeth, after Lady Macbeth convinces her husband to murder the king, she sees his blood on her hands, and she tries to get rid of it. She can't get rid of this imaginary blood because of her conscience. And she's crying, out, spot out, and she's trying to get rid of the blood. Shakespeare understood that murder is no small thing, and it can do this to you. And I think that's what's happening here with Herod. He thinks it's John the Baptist back from the dead because his own guilt is speaking to him. Here's what that was about. For Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested and had put him bound and had him bound and put in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. So the plot thickens. According to the historian Josephus, John was imprisoned in the fortress of Perea. That's on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, as I said. Herodias, and it just helps make it more confusing, right? Herod and Herodias, help us out, people. Herodias is the daughter of Aristobulus, the granddaughter of Herod the Great. And you're thinking, wait a minute, Herod was the son of Herod the Great. This is his granddaughter. That you are correct. That makes Herod Antipas her uncle. So she married one uncle, and then she switched and married the other uncle. This is a messed up family. It's worthy of a Shakespeare play, I tell you this. The point that he ran afoul was Leviticus 18:6 makes it clear that you cannot marry your brother's wife if your brother is still alive. It is forbidden. It's one of those rules that is explicitly forbidden. Don't take your brother's wife, unless your brother's, dead, in which case she's a widow, and marry her. You can't do it. The niece thing just makes it even weirder, but it was a violation of the law. On top of that, so it gets worse, to marry Herodias, whom he was smitten with, Herod had first to get rid of the wife that he already had. She was married and he was married. It's a daytime soap opera. It's getting worse. He was married to a woman named Phasaelus, and her father was King Aretes IV, the king of Nabatea. That happens to be the kingdom that borders Perea on the east. So he had married the daughter of the kingdom next door's king. That's a very delicate situation. He's going to get rid of this woman, the daughter of a king, and tell her to hit the road. This could easily fall apart for Herod. And of course it did. Aretes was not happy that his daughter was treated this way and went to war with Herod Antipas, a border war, not a massive war, but a skirmishing and raiding on the borders. Herod's kingdom was soundly defeated in this. The Romans had to intervene and put a stop to it. It was a complete disaster for him. Just to give you the end of the story, Tiberius was the Roman emperor who died in 37 AD. That's a little bit after this. In 39, Herod Antipas was accused by the new emperor, was accused by his nephew, Agrippa I, of plotting against the new emperor, a man named Caligula. You might have heard of Caligula. He was a little bit insane. He was emperor from 37 to 41 when his own Praetorian Guard assassinated him. There's a lot of threads here. I'm doing my best. Caligula had Herod exiled to Spain, which is as far away in the Roman Empire as you can get from where he came from, and Herodias went with him. The two went off to Spain, and that's the last we hear of them. History doesn't know when they died or anything after that. And to add one more piece to this puzzle, Herod Antipas is the one in the Passion narrative to whom Pilate sends Jesus. Oh, he's from Galilee, send him to Herod. And Jesus goes and talks to him, and then Herod sends him back to Pilate. That's the guy we're talking about. So this is chaos, right? I've just given you a lot of chaos. Don't worry about the names and all of that. Just consider that it's a mess. It's a real mess. There's politics involved. There's a very weird, intertwined family tree going on here. There's stealing your brother's wife. I mean, this is a mess. The last thing that Herod needs as a famous prophet going around publicly saying he's in the wrong. This is immoral. This is against the law. God will not tolerate this. That's the last thing Herod needs. For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. This is not a controversial opinion. This is not out there. This is not a difficult explanation of the law. The law was clear. Don't take your brother's wife. You can't do it. That's all John said. Read the book. It's there. It's black and white. About this situation, John Calvin, himself not foreign to controversy and difficult times, wrote, "We behold in John an illustrious example of that moral courage which all pious teachers ought to possess, not to hesitate to incur the wrath of the great and powerful, as often as it may be found necessary. For he with whom there is acceptance of persons does not honestly serve God." John Calvin said, if you are a prophet, a minister, a person responsible to God, and you are quiet because the rich and powerful are the ones doing it, you're not serving God. It's a paraphrase. So the marriage of Herod Antipas to his niece and the wife of his brother was a scandal ripe for criticism. Any number of prominent religious and political leaders in Judea, in the area, the high priest, any of them could have said, that's wrong, don't do that. You can't do it. I have no idea if any of them spoke up. How many of them spoke up? How many of them said something? We know John did. We don't know about any of them. We don't know how many of them did a quick calculation and said, I don't need Herod Antipas as an enemy, so I'm just going to mun's a word on this. Some, I'm sure, decided that discretion is the better part of valor, and they didn't need to step in front of a bullet, and they were just going to let this one slide. But John the Baptist spoke up, evidently loudly, publicly, repeatedly, enough so that it got him arrested. Reminds me of what the Nazis did during World War II in many of the German churches. They sent Gestapo to sit in the pews and listen to the sermon to see if the minister needed to be arrested. And I know some of them looked at what they had written and said, not this, we're not saying that today. And some of them did say exactly what they were planning on saying. John the Baptist was not deterred. He spoke. But why here, why now? It's an interesting question. Remember that his mission in life, the thing for which he was prophesied and born and raised, was to be the forerunner of the Messiah, for his cousin Jesus, to prepare the way of the Lord. But at this point in the story, he's already baptized Jesus. He's already said, he must become greater, I must become less. He's already said to his disciples, follow him, not me. I'm not the star of the show, he is. That's all past. What's the rest of John's life supposed to be? Did you ever think about that? This was the thing for which he was born. He's already accomplished it. He's a little early for retirement. What does he do? What do you do next when you reach the top of the mountain? His mission is finished. What does he do? Well, John did what many righteous people in similar situations like him have done. It's what Elijah did. 1 Kings told us about that. It's what Harriet Beecher Stowe did when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer did when faced with the Nazi atrocities. It's what Martin Luther King Jr. did, and many, many, many others spoke up. And the same thing happened to John that happened to many of them. He paid for it with his freedom and then his life. So what are we talking about here? The phrase that exemplifies what this passage is about is speaking truth to power. It's a well-known phrase. You've probably heard it. You might not know exactly what it means. Let me tell you what it isn't. It isn't being an internet troll. It isn't insulting people and lobbing grenades at people you disagree with. And it's not about fighting fire with fire. That's not what it's about. What is it? It's a very simple thing, and it's based on these truths. Number one, that those in power, whether it's Herod Antipas 2,000 years ago, or a governor or a president or a owner of a company or a superintendent of a school or the pastor of a church or anybody with power, that people in power tend to be insulated from the truth. The more power you have, the more likely it is that sycophants will surround you and tell you what you want to hear. Because by telling you what you want to hear, they want to be rewarded. And people who would tell you the truth, the more power you have, whether it's a big fish in a little pond or a big fish in a big pond, it doesn't matter. It's the same. It's the same in a small town if you are that guy that everybody's afraid of, or if you're one of the most powerful people in the world, it's exactly the same. Either way, people are afraid to tell them the truth. So the more power you gain, the less you hear the truth. Secondly, those with more power can do more harm with the choices they make than ordinary people. The choices that you or I make will not ripple around this country and around the world, but there are people living today whose choices, whether for better or for worse, whether for harm or for good, can do tremendous things and have massive influence. Thirdly, it takes a certain kind of person to stand up. It takes someone like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It takes someone like Daniel. It takes someone like Esther or Elijah or John the Baptist. When the powerful go astray, and tell them you are in the wrong. In order to do that, you need two things. First thing you need is to be able to see the truth. If you don't know what the problem is, if you don't know what the error is, you obviously can't tell that person. And secondly, you need to have the courage and the eloquence and the charisma to make that objection stick. Especially when you're up against a chorus of yes men selling honeyed words to the person in power. Oftentimes in history we see one person, one man, one woman that has that big impact. But every once in a while, it's not one person. It's a million people saying the same thing at the same time and having more of a cumulative impact. So that's what we're talking about here. Speaking truth to power, John the Baptist being willing to speak up, and a long line of people before him and after that have done the same thing. So what happened to John for saying that? So Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him, but she was not able to because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. Herod is an odd man. It's very difficult for us to understand what's going on with him. John told Herod he was in an immoral marriage. John told Herod that he was risking the wrath of God by continuing in this marriage, and yet Herod saved John's life, at least for a while, from his wife. That seems weird. Why is he doing this? He was willing to risk war, which he ended up fighting, for this woman, but not willing to murder John for her. I think a couple reasons make sense. Number one, even if he was willing to thumb his nose at societal norms, right? Even if he was willing to do something that people out there in the public might say, oh my goodness, I can't believe he did that, he wasn't necessarily willing to poke God in the eye. Just to say, hey God, you want to mess with me? Hey God. By murdering a prophet. Because John's reputation and John's character was spotless. Everybody respected the character of John. John had no skeletons in his closet. John had no contradictions in his character that left people open to be able to say, oh, it's just John the Baptist. Don't listen to him. You know that he blah, 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 blah. John wasn't like that. That actually happens all the time. People that try to speak with moral authority about an issue are dismissed because they themselves have their own flaws that make it seem like they're being a hypocrite. That happens all the time. And often it's true. But not John. Even though Herod didn't necessarily appreciate what this prophet was saying, he knew that prophets had a connection with God, and he wasn't willing to mess with that. And then lastly, it's very odd, but Herod enjoyed listening to John. I'm not sure what's going on there. Herod liked listening to John's explanations, his sermons, his messages, even though John kept telling him that you're an immoral man. So Herod was willing to arrest John, willing to keep him quiet, and thus protect his own power, but he was unwilling or afraid to go any further than that. And we see this happen all the time in the world today. A government will be willing to arrest a protester or arrest a rebel, but not kill them. Because when you kill them, you make martyrs of them and you make the movement grow. Much better to silence them, to make them disappear. This happens all the time in authoritative countries. Protesters just disappear. One day they were here, the next they're gone. Happens in China, happens in Russia, happens in Iran, happens in Saudi Arabia, happens in a lot of places. There have been times in American history it's happened here too. That kind of thing happens. It's easier than publicly executing someone. But the story doesn't end there. This is a little bit long. Let me read it anyway. Finally, the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. The king said to the girl, "Ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you." And he promised her with an oath, "Whatever you ask, I will give you up to half my kingdom." That phrase at the end was actually very common. You see it in a lot of historic sources. It's the kind of thing a rich, powerful man like Herod does to show he's a big shot, right? I am so cool and powerful and amazing. I will promise you up to half my kingdom. He doesn't actually mean I'm going to give you half the kingdom, but he means I'm so rich that whatever you ask for, it won't even bother me. He's trying to look like a big deal in front of his friends, in front of his cronies, in front of other rich and important people. She went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask for?" "The head of John the Baptist," she answered. We don't know much about this girl. Many things have been speculated about her, but we really don't know much of anything. She asks her mom for advice. Not a bad idea normally. We don't know how old she is, and it's hard to say how culpable she is in about what's about to happen. But at once the girl hurried to the king with a request. "I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter." Whether she was 13 or 18, it doesn't matter. She did what her mother asked and took a part in the killing of a righteous man. Yes, she's only one cog in this twisted machine. Herod and Herodias bear the vast majority of the guilt in this. But know this too, power always has minions willing to carry out its evil plans. If history tells us anything, it's that power always has henchmen. They're usually in the movies, the guys that 007 or whatever takes out, boom, 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 they can't shoot straight. They're stormtroopers, basically, all right? Power always has, I'll help you out with that one. Power always has stormtroopers, nameless, unremembered people willing to carry out the evil requests of the bad guy. How do I know this? Because I know this from our own recent history. Hitler had willing accomplices in the Holocaust. You don't actually think that Hitler himself murdered 6 million Jews and 4 or 5 million other people personally, right? He didn't pull very many triggers. He didn't murder people himself. But he had literally hundreds of thousands of people willing to murder in furtherance of his goals. And on top of all of those people, Gestapo, SS soldiers, guards in the camps, on top of all of them that you think, oh, well, obviously those are the villains. In addition to them, there were tens of millions of people living in Europe. Germans, Dutch, French, Polish, of all nationalities, who either acquiesced and did a little bit to help, or they said nothing. The number of people who fought against that regime can be measured in the tens of thousands. The number of people who acquiesced, who did nothing, who didn't stop it, in the tens of millions. 100 to 1 probably. People on the side of evil versus people fighting against it. And you look at that example and you say, the Nazis, horrible, I'm with you. But stop for a minute and remember that that's not just their history. That's our history too. Go back in American history and read about our interaction with Indians. Read about the genocide of Native Americans, of Indians in this country. Powerful people pushed it forward, and thousands of regular people participated. People in the army, settlers, people working for the Department of the Interior, all sorts of people involved in it. I just finished one of the most noted biographies of Lincoln. One of the interesting things about that, to me, is that Lincoln blamed the North as much as the South for slavery. Because in the North were the men that owned the boats that brought the slaves over on the Atlantic slave trade. In the North were the businessmen that bought the cotton from the slaves, from the plantations that employed slaves. They were complicit. And even though the Declaration of Independence declared that all men are created equal, the Constitution did not say that at all. So Abraham Lincoln said we're all involved in this and we all need to fight to eradicate it. So yeah, our history also shows that far too few people spoke up when evil was happening in their own time. Far too few people stood with the oppressed, and far too many with the oppressors. Far too few people had moral courage. Every time you read in history about evil, that is true. It has been famously said that the only thing that evil requires to succeed is for good men to do nothing. And that's absolutely true. Notice I haven't spoken about any particular. I'm talking about a principle. I'm not trying to tell you exactly where this applies in our world today, in our country today, in our community today. I'm trying to tell you that this has been true throughout all of human history, and nothing about 2021 is any different than what it was during the Nazis, during American slavery, during John the Baptist, and all of the rest. We are exactly the same. 26. The king was greatly distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he didn't want to refuse her. So he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. There's actually many paintings of this scene. I chose not to use one of them, because I think it's a little bit morbid to put John the Baptist's head on a platter from a painting, but artists have been fascinated with that for centuries. What is the great moral evil behind this moment? Herod's vanity. He was a vain man. He didn't want to look the fool. He didn't want people to snicker about him. He didn't want his friends calling him a wuss. He didn't want to be made fun of. So he ordered the murder of a righteous man. That's how evil excuses its use of power. It's not that glamorous sometimes. It's just vanity. It's just greed. It's just lust. Garden variety evils in the heart of man. Famously, Lord Acton, British nobleman, wrote this: "Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely." It's one of my favorite quotes of all time because it's absolutely true. Humanity is fallen and depraved, and we will always abuse power. It does not matter what economic system you have. It does not matter what government system you have. Unless those with power are held in check by those with the courage of being right and speaking the truth, they will abuse it. Democratic government, republic government, monarchy, despotism, it does not matter. This will happen in every single one of those systems if people do nothing. So in the United States of America, we have an incredible freedom to speak without the fear of arrest and execution. We're not like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We're not like Jan Hus. We're not like John the Baptist. We're not like so many others that I could mention who were taking a risk, a real risk by speaking. I'm not talking about the risk of being unfriended on Facebook, as damaging psychologically as that can be. I'm talking about actual risk to life and limb. John paid with his life for speaking the truth to power. The cost to you and me and everyone else in this country of being willing to speak the truth to power is far, far, far less. So let me just add one caveat before I finish up with the last verse. If you're waiting until January 20th to either start or stop doing something like this, because in your mind that either ends the problem or starts the problem. You get what I'm saying? If that date is what's going to make you speak up or be silent, you have not heard anything that I'm talking about today, and you're missing the entire point. Because John was not a partisan. John was not promoting his brand of power over another kind of power. He was speaking against power. He was not hoping to gain power, but simply be moral. And lastly, our battles are primarily closer to home. For each one of us, for our community, for our congregation, the things that concern us that we can be involved in and make a difference in are a lot closer than Washington. They're in our own school systems, in our community, in the place where we work, with our own family, with our own church, with our own community organizations. That is where our moral courage and our voices are needed the most. The postscript to the story. On hearing this, John's disciples came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. John paid the price, and it was martyrdom. He didn't seek martyrdom, but he also didn't keep quiet because he was afraid of it. Esther faced a similar choice in the book of Esther. Her uncle Mordecai famously told her as she vacillated, she was unsure, should I speak up? I will risk my life if I speak up. Mordecai said to her, who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? You see, you are you for a reason. In the place that you inhabit in this world, with the connections and the relationships that you have, for a reason. And that reason is not to be silent. 2 words of application from this text. Firstly, in order to speak truth to power, John the Baptist needed to have a righteous reputation. He needed to know what the truth was, and then he needed to have the courage to share it. So for each one of us, let's flip that around. When God calls you to speak, and I don't know what those situations are going to be, I don't know where you can make a difference, but when God does speak to your heart and mind, you need these same 3 things. You need to have a reputation that will withstand scrutiny. You need to have knowledge of the truth that is sufficient for the moment. And you need to have courage that rests upon your faith in Almighty God. If we could go get